My name's Emma. I'm the Director of Fishing into the Future. We run these Fit for Talks with the main idea that we want to connect people and we want to share knowledge. So with that, I'm going to pass over to our chair and our host for today, David Stevens, who's going to kick us off on this talk about responding to the consultation on flyseining. I'm looking forward to it. So
good afternoon and evening, everyone, depending where you are. I'd just like to thank you all, many of you, for coming. It's great to have such a huge cross-section. We've pretty much got all parties involved in this, which is great. For those who know, who don't know, Fishing in the Future is set up on one of our roles is to allow independent consultation, a voice to the industry. We're totally impartial, so we're not here to sort of set an agenda. We're here just to give the space for the industry to come together to discuss the challenges that they're facing at the time. And today is the flyseining consultation that's been put out by DEFRA. DEFRA approached Emma a few weeks ago and asked Emma, would Fishing in the Future be able to do something on the consultation, just to try and reach people who haven't had the chance to do it. And we thought it would be a good idea to get as many people from the people who are involved in the non-quota species fisheries in the Channel and the North Sea, and hear voices from around the UK about how traditional flyseining is done, and give people who are involved in present flyseining a chance to have their say as well. So I'd like to just thank everyone for being able to come. We've also got representatives from France here, representatives from the under 10 and over 10 sector in the UK, and from the Dutch flyseining and the UK flyseining community, and people from Scotland with an idea of how it's done in other parts of the country. So I'd just like to thank you all for coming. So I was going to start off today by asking Phil McBryde to give you an overview of the consultation that DEFRA has set out, and hopefully Phil will be able to, just give the reasons behind why DEFRA felt the need to do this. So Phil, if I could pass over to you. And
great, thanks, David, and thanks to you and Emma for organising this, and Fishing into the Future for giving us in DEFRA the opportunity to talk to, I guess, a wider group of people than we often get, and different ends of the spectrum around flyseining. I won't pretend to have any great in-depth knowledge about the technique. That's where you guys come in. But I guess what I can just start with is just by saying that the idea behind the consultation is simply to recognise some of the concerns that have been expressed over the last 18 months or so, I guess in two ways. Those concerns have been expressed around what it's doing to those fish stocks. So we're talking here demersal, non-quota species, where we don't have a great deal of data. They're vulnerable, we think, in some cases. They're certainly data poor, and they're certainly valuable. So there's a kind of wider push for how we manage non-quota species. You would have seen that recognised in the draft joint fisheries statements, which we hope will be published by the end of this month, but also complemented by recognition in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement around the importance of NQS and developing multi-year strategies to help with the conservation of those species. So that's a bit of the framework, and obviously you're aware of the fisheries management plans, and particularly bass, some of the shellfish species, but also the channel demersal NQS that the MMO is leading on. And again, that's a recognition that in those front runner FMPs, that NQS is at the very front of the real vanguard of how we get in place a bit of a framework for managing stocks that aren't especially well managed, but are obviously valuable, and for which there's not a great deal of evidence, as you know. And I guess the other element to this consultation is around the impact of the specific gear that we are hearing has started to have an impact on those stocks. Now, it's really hard to quantify some of this. We've got landings data, we've got vessel numbers, and that's captured in the consultation document. But what we don't have is that broader evidence about impact on stocks. As landings have gone up and vessel numbers have crept up, it's clear that the capacity of the current Flyseining fleet has grown, and in many respects we could regard this as a new fishery. Now, I recognise that traditional Flyseining does not necessarily fit into this model of the greater effort and capacity, and I'm really interested to hear views about how different the techniques might be and what the impacts might be. So the consultation is really designed to fill in some evidence gaps, but also we propose some measures that have come broadly from talking to fishermen over the last 18 months. But we want to understand whether those measures are viable, whether they're deliverable, practicable, what kind of impact they might have on fishermen, and whether we look at all of them, whether we look at some of them in combination, whether there's one alone that is the magic silver bullet. I suspect not, because as you know better than I, fisheries is complex. There's lots of regulation. There's lots of capacity for government to intervene and get it wrong, and that's why we need a consultation, why we need this discussion, to make sure that we're getting the best possible advice and steer as to the direction that we perhaps need to go in. I think one of the questions you might also have is, why are we doing this now, or why not before, when we've got the channel demersal FMP? There's a recognition that I guess we've needed to gather a bit more evidence around data, around landings in particular, and we've got a 3-year period going back to sort of 2018, 2019 that's in the consultation that allows us to track a bit of a, particularly in the UK fleet, but a bit of an uplift in those landings. But also the channel demersal FMP is in progress, a number of you feeding into it already, but it's not due to be published until the end of next year. And it won't have implementation measures as such. It'll have recommendations, measures, ambitions, goals, objectives, and so on, with a view to some of those measures coming into place, I guess, in 2024. What we want to try and do with this consultation is see if there's something we can do a bit more urgently, so that we're taking some action now, and to, I guess, understand whether some of those sort of short-term responses have a bit of life into the medium and longer term. And the FMP, I would expect, would wrap up some of that management so that they will complement the consultation and the outcome, and any measures that we put in place, if that's the direction we're steered in, would complement that longer term management. So they don't sit outside of each other, but they sit alongside each other. Just to flag, so consultation opened on 25th of August. It closes 1 minute to midnight on the 16th of November. I can send a link to the Citizen Space. Some of you, I think, have already submitted responses, for which many thanks. We've had 22 responses so far, which actually for a fisheries consultation over some is pretty good going, I think. But it'd be really good to get a broader, wider breadth of responses from across the fishing community. So I really just thank you for the opportunity to set out why we're doing this, and to, I guess, listen to different, perhaps conflicting views about how we should take this forward.
Thanks very much, David. Yeah, I have 3 minutes. Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's worth just looking at the history very briefly. I made a couple of notes. So we had the EU exit, 1,700 odd European vessels, including I think 194 from Dutch boats were licensed, including these Flyseiners. Phil Haslam, who was then Director of Operations for the MMO, said to us that they'd licensed them and then they were going to undertake an impact assessment, which rather strikes me as shutting the door after the horse has bolted. And that is still, as far as I'm aware, ongoing. I haven't seen any responses from it. So we were really reflecting the comments that were coming into NUTFA from a whole range of fishermen, and increasingly concerned fishermen at the impact of this activity. And we were getting calls even from the other side of the channel, because, and you'll hear from Thibault, obviously, in a similar way. So I suppose our concerns were really around the fact that obviously it was having a dramatic impact, and from the range of calls, then it was very clear that this wasn't just a one-off or a local area. It was the entire expanse of the activities of the primarily Dutch or flagship seiners to do that. Our concerns were strengthened by the fact that then Fishery Minister Victoria Prentice said that she and the UK agreed not to apply the NQS tonnage limits provided for in the trade and cooperation agreements for 2022, and the problem she and her officials have, I quote her, is actually being able to closely monitor uptake data, and that was mirrored really by a report in the Netherlands papers that the Dutch government had admitted that they really didn't have the staff to monitor it. So you had no catch limits, or no effective catch limits, and you had no effective monitoring and no physical checks. So it's very then difficult to assess the impact of a fishing operation if you don't have any of that data. This again is against the background. I mean, we lost, according to the MMO, 700 catching related jobs in the UK between 2019 and 2020, and the impact or the reports coming to us. And I stress that we pride ourselves on reflecting the comments that we get. These are not my view or the view of Sarah, my partner, or whatever else. These are reflecting the views of individual and groups of fishermen. And this was reflected the same in the pulse fishing. That's how that started. So that's where we were. We've been talking to DEFRA now for with all due respect, Phil, feels like forever, but we know that these wheels turn very, very slowly. There's been a whole raft of suggestions made as to the way forward. It appeared to us from comments we've made that really, looking at the legislation, looking at the problems in monitoring and enforcement and regulation, that the most straightforward way for the channel at least would be to go for a 221 kilowatt limit, which is about 300 horsepower. There is an example of this already. There's a limit on 221 kilowatts within 12 miles for beam trawlers, and that's clearly there for a reason, to protect inshore grounds and inshore stock. So it seemed quite sensible and very straightforward. I'll stop there, David, for the time being.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think we can get into the details as we go into the next part of it. But thanks very much for your presentation and giving an overview of how it's affecting. Yeah, okay. Well, the next was Richard Hards from the North Sea Fishermen's, North Sea PO. Richard, if you'd like to give an overview.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, David. Well, I mean, following on from what Phil's saying, non-quota species are very data deficient, and there's variable noticeable differences in both non-quota and quota species every year. Red mullet catches have significantly increased this year in the Eastern Channel, and as have cuttlefish, which historically this is more a Western Channel fishery. So there is movement there. I mean, cod, if we look at, I know this is about non-quota, but if we look at cod, that's virtually disappeared from the southern North Sea. The Dover sole landings have been very low. That flyseining is more prevalent now as a factor directed by economics as well as historical opportunities. A vessel's track record being restricted due to the change in patterns of quota fish. Flyseine is a seasonal fishery from November to the end of March for the majority of vessels before switching to twin rig fishing in spring, summer months in central and northern North Sea. Now, I've been on meetings before where, and Phil has mentioned as high as 3,000 horsepower. We believe that this myth of high horsepower is based upon older converted beam trawlers engaged in this fishery. Engine power plays no part in flyseining. It's all down to hydraulic power with the rope winches. We do not really understand what some of the suggestions are based upon. Flyseine uses a greater mesh size to restrict drag when hauling, tapering down to the cod end, where the smallest mesh, which we've pointed this out, can be 65 millimeters, but predominantly 80 millimeter. No vessel we know uses 40 millimeter other than the Morifirth squid fishery. so if that's an introduction to that, well, so be it. We have previously detailed gear operations to DEFRA and have been told it is a small number of EU vessels that are causing the concern, but yet to see this evidence. I just left another meeting and where the discussions with the EU, and they say that there's a few issues on the data from EU remaining. I don't know how far that's got, and perhaps that's something for Phil to come back on, but thanks.
Oh, thanks, Richard. And I think we can get into sort of the discussion about technical measures and limits later on, I'm hoping, and get a good feel of how everyone feels about it. So, but thanks, Richard. If that's okay, I'm going to go to Mike next, Mike Park, Scottish Whitefish Producer Organisation. And if you could just give us an idea of, you know, I mean, Richard mentioned about horsepower, does it affect, and I think you've done it, Mike, you've done seine netting. It'd be interesting to get an idea of how things are done in Scotland and, you know, more of, you know, the traditional way of saying of doing it. Is it any different?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, I stepped into the wheelhouse of my first 26-metre seiner when I was 20 years old. So I then went on to seine for about 30 years. And way back then when I started, probably in Scotland, there was, I don't know, maybe 250, 300 seine net vessels, traditionally working 12 or 13 coil of, at that time, probably would have been 26mm rope. There was no wire rope at that time. But obviously after the decommissioning of 2001, 2003, that number of vessels decreased significantly. And I think now in Scotland, we have around 80 targeting whitefish vessels, of which 10 are at the seine net. Now, the vast majority of the vessels left at the seine net have moved from the 12 coil of the 28mm to the 16 and 17 coil of the 40mm and as high as 50mm. And the type of nets have developed as well. I mean, in my day, I used to rug everything over hard bottom. And in those days, I was using maybe 8-inch discs, 8-inch hoppers, maybe 10-inch hoppers. But now you're talking about, you know, 18-inch hoppers and 24-inch hoppers. So everything develops over time. Now, even the Scottish seine developed from what we call the Danish seine, the anchor seine. So the Danish vessels lie at anchor, they then leave the anchor, tie the rope to the anchor, shoot around in the triangular, whatever shape they think is best for them, come back, pick up the anchor, and then they pull the rope to the vessel against the anchor. Whereas the Scottish fly shooter, and again, same as the fly shooting is going down in the channel, you know, it's pretty much you travel over ground at about 1 knot ordinarily, because we tow through the tide down in the channel. They tend to tow before the tide, which for us is bonkers, because we were always taught to tow through the tide, which we always do, and run port and starboard bags so that you're always picking up your day on the right side of the tide. So things have developed over time. What's been the driver for that? Well, it was technology that always held us back. Originally, when I started, it was with a Beckles coiler with the ropes on the deck, which used to knock bits out of your arms when you were lifting it up and storing it. We then moved on to rope bins. We then moved on to rope reels. And these were sort of small rope reels, low-powered rope reels. And as things have developed, people have developed into heavier rope, bigger discs, more powerful winches. And, you know, as long as you're sensible and as long as it's within a sort of accepted management regime, there is no problem with operating heavier ropes and longer ropes. And indeed, you know, some of the discussion I hear going down in the channel about this smacks to me more about, you know, territorial rights than it does about, well, is this a bad thing to do? It's almost like it's getting bigger. Well, it must be bad, mustn't it? So I think we need to be very careful. But I'm willing to stop there, David, and pick up the more technical discussion about what's right, wrong, and, you know, when we look back at the European Commission 850 and 98, which was the technical regulation at the time, everything was paternalistic and prescriptive. And we really need to be careful that we don't move into that territory. But I'll leave that for the next phase if you call me in again. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, Emma said that Gertz has joined from Holland. So if Gertz, if you'd want to give an idea, because I think you're involved, or your vessels are involved in the fishery, if you could give an idea of, you know, how these rules may affect your vessel.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me in this meeting, and also, of course, we will take part in the consultation from DEFRA, and we will answer the questions best as possible. For your information in general, I don't want to go into the details. Richard and Mike already told you about Flyseining and the technique as such. But I heard, for example, Mr. Percy, especially looking to the Dutch Flyseining and so forth, etc. I can inform you that in Holland, since 2000, so more than 20 years already, the maximum number of vessels who may use Flyseining is 24. We have only 24 licenses, and therefore, from the 24, since 2 decades already, only 21 are used at this moment. We don't fish with the Dutch vessels. We don't fish inside the 12-mile zone of the UK. Not at all. We have not the right. We have not the access to the UK 12-mile zone. So of course we can have try to make management rules and management plans, etc. But I think that it is very important, because we have to do with high migration species through the English Channel, the southern part of the North Sea, etc., that we make management plans together with all the stakeholders. So not only, I think it is not wise to do it only on the UK responsibility, but we need to do that together. We tried 2-3 years ago already in a gentleman's agreement to make arrangements on the length of the rope, the number of days at sea, etc. But at the end of the day, when we almost were there were some problems in France, and we didn't have the success to come to the gentleman agreement. So I think that is from my side the most important information from the Dutch side, and of course I'm very happy and willing to answer some questions, but we don't have the increase which someone mentioned and tried to make. We had already for more than 2 decades, more than 20 years, maximum number of licenses for Flyseining, fly shooting in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Gert. Okay, I think Aaron's joined the call now, so we have somebody else who's directly involved in fishery in the southwest. So Aaron, if you're able to speak, we're trying to keep it between 3 to 5 minutes, Aaron. Okay.
No worries at all, David. Can you hear me?
Right.
Yes,
yeah,
we can hear you. It's a bit dark, but excellent. I think it's more my views you're after than my good looks. So
yeah,
it's a bit dark. Anyway, well, really, essentially where this comes up, if you're looking at management, there clearly is an issue going on down in the channel, and where myself and other senior skippers that have been speaking in France, Britain and Ireland are coming from, is a worry that a fishery and a method that always has been sustainable and proved itself sustainable, having been used by kind of generations of senior men now in similar sized vessels since the 80s, are being tarred with a brush, particularly by the green groups, whose eye is directed at these mammoth behemoths that the Dutch have built, which are colossal in size and power and gear compared to anything that anybody in Britain and Ireland has done for years. And we very much worry that 2 things is going to happen. Either the rest of us are going to get tarred with the same brush, banned with the Dutch, or these vessels get displaced from the Eastern Channel and Southern North Sea onto our traditional grounds. And with the power that they've got, we're already snookered. We're already seeing that happening. Dutch boats, flagships moving west and north. So something needs to be done, clearly. In my view, there's 3 ways you manage a fishery. Either it's by limiting effort, that's time at sea, or 3 ways of limiting effort and catching capacity is time at sea, or technical measures, or quotas. So quotas haven't, in mixed fisheries, covered themselves in glory. They're a system everybody's having to live with now, especially since people have put enormous amounts of money in it. And I think putting that into the fishery that's down there, we end up with the same dysfunctional system imposed on the non-quota stocks as happened north, where we get bad data, and we don't actually see what's in the sea being landed. We just see what we're allowed to catch. So I don't think anybody would really want to emulate the quota system where it could be avoided. So the other options are either time at sea or technical measures. And I think that the Dutch themselves, and the French in particular, have been primarily looking at down that road. And I think that would be the sensible one to go to, where we talk about reining seine netting back to size and power and gear that has proved itself sustainable, proved itself that people can make money with it. Because currently just now having 42-metre boats with 2,500 horsepower towing 80mm rope over any ground that they can basically go over with nets that would make heavy metal trawlers flush is just ridiculous for the area, in my view. That isn't making a living, that's just greed. And it's as simple as that. Some people might not like that, but that's what it comes down to. So something needs to be done. The French want something done and have been trying to. The Irish want to see something. The British want to see something. And I think even a lot of the Dutch boats want to see something. So there's the opportunity to do it sensibly. And I think personally that's playing it back to it's proved itself sustainable since the 1980s, which is basically what the British and Irish fleet are that. Put a cap on kilowatts, tonnage, rope size, because that's easy to measure and enforce at sea on. And as your gentleman from the Netherlands said, the Dutch of industry, the Dutch government has already put in a limit in numbers. And that's maybe something that Britain could look to do as well across our own fleet and any vessels that are licensed to access. Because really just now, a lot of the problem, the biggest culprits in the channel, the biggest vessels are all in the British register as flagships. So that's something that DEFRA and MMO is allowed to happen. So yeah, there's scope there to do something. People want something to do, and it appears that the French have already kind of gone down the road that would seem sensible, which is a limitation in the size and power in the fishery, and possibly vessel numbers as well.
Right, thank you, Aaron. Thanks for your perspective there. And you know, you mentioned the French many times, so we do have Bull with us on the call. So I'd be really interested actually in the French perspective. I haven't heard this yet. So to all, if you'd like to speak and just give a perspective how you view things from France.
Hear me well?
Yeah, we can.
Great. So yeah, I'm Thibault. I'm working for a French NGO called Pleine Mer, and we are an NGO of fishers and fish consumers working towards sustainability in the fishery sector, basically. In terms of what's happening in France, well, the issues are mostly similar in terms of basically the impacts that fly shooting has had in the channel and is still having, because most species that are targeted are non-quota species, so red mullet, cuttlefish, calamari, etc. And we've had a lot of testimonies from artisanal small-scale fishers about the impacts of fly shooting, mostly Dutch fly shooting, but also French, because as you may know, French fishers in Boulogne and Étaples have developed a technique a decade ago. And there was this gentleman agreement that someone talked about that was like a year and a half ago, trying to legitimize a lot of Dutch boats practicing this technique in the channel. But then French fishers, some French institutions were in favor of that, some were not. So the gentleman agreement didn't actually happen. But from our side, in terms of managing this technique, I mean, people want a ban on it. French fishers are in favor of a complete moratorium, NGOs as well. So that's mostly what we have been advocating for. And even the fishers who've been using fly shooting, the French fishers in Boulogne and Étaples, are now in favor of a complete ban on this technique because they've seen themselves the impact it had on their own fishing grounds, and they're back to traditional trolling now. So yeah, Bloom, in the last few months, actually, Bloom, which is another French NGO, has done a tremendous work trying to modify the Fifth Amendment of the CFP in order to put that ban into place in the channel. But it didn't work out because some member states refused the proposal. So that was in September. And but yeah, mostly what I can bring to this debate today is that French fishers, small-scale fishers, those who never practiced fly shooting and those who actually have practiced this technique, are in favor of a complete ban in the channel in order to protect the resources that they see are definitely endangered by this technique. And I think in the UK, Greenpeace UK has done a lot of work on this issue, but I was wondering why I don't see them in the panel. Anyways, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. Well, luckily we had you here, and you know, I think NGOs need a presence, but we don't want to be swamped by NGOs. I think is how we feel about it. You know, I mean, some really strong differences in views. You know, total bans. You know, that's something I would never totally advocate. As a you know, you have livelihoods here at stake, and I think, you know, the idea here is to find compromises and hear how this is affecting everybody, and can we find a common way forward? I think that's the most important thing, and hopefully that's what DEFRA are looking to achieve, I'm sure, and that's what their consultation will come out. And you know, the more we can add to that consultation, the better. So just really following for that, Phil, I'd like to just go back to Phil, and I suppose I've got a couple of questions before we go into the next part of this. Is Phil talked about you know, the lack of real data that they had before they started this consultation, and you know, I'd like to know for Phil, you know, firstly your views on what you've heard so far, and secondly, are you confident that we've got enough data to go about this consultation in the right way? Do you feel that you're kind of edging towards more of a cautionary approach to let the industry prove after, or are you looking at you know, to take a sort of a let's get the data first, you know, or is data second and proving it after? So Phil, if you don't mind. I'd like
yeah, no, thanks, David, and really interesting to hear lots of different perspectives from both sides of the channel. I mean, I think what that proves is this is not a straightforward issue to resolve, and that compromises will have to be made, and that we need to find some kind of consensus. Doing nothing doesn't feel like an option from the evidence we've got. So just to pick up on something that Richard said, I mean, this isn't about EU vessels. It's certainly about the increased effort from UK flagged vessels, but this would apply if we put in place measures. They would apply to all vessels in English waters. So it's not a UK-wide solution. It's particularly because of the effort in the channel, but it's an English waters consideration, and it would apply to all vessels regardless of where they're flagged. And I guess, Richard, the other thing you picked up on was just around some of the data challenges we've had with the EU. Most of those are resolved. There are some quirks that still need to be resolved. Experts are doing that. But we're fairly confident that the data we've got on uptake from EU vessels and UK vessels in respective waters is accurate. So yeah, I mean, Dave, just to answer your question, I mean, yes, it's really interesting here, a spectrum of views, and that there are different ways of looking at this, and that there is no single magic bullet. that is going to resolve the tensions that are clearly in place in the channel. The number one consideration for us is looking at what this type of fishing and this type of effort with the increased capacity of the current Flyseining fleet, and understanding what that impact that has on non-quota species. That's our primary concern. The evidence we have is, as you know, I'd said, and as you've picked up, is not as robust as we'd like it to be. So it's based on landings, it's based on vessel numbers. But what the landings does tell us is that there's been an increased effort, particularly from UK flagged vessels, and we'd be foolish not to look at that. And also, you invoke the precautionary approach. That is a consideration, and as the Fisheries Act directs us, not having data is not sufficient to sit back and do nothing. So we do have the virus and the opportunity to put something in place to help manage that increased effort, if we can find some kind of consensus around what those measures should be, and we obviously get the sort of the right, robust foundation to enable us to do that. How we do that and how we implement that, if that's the direction we go in, whether that's secondary legislation, and you'll be aware that Parliament's got quite a lot to consider over the next 12 months or so with the retained EU law programme. But that's one option. Licence conditions is another possibility, depending on which measures we feel, or you tell us, and we feel are the most appropriate to help manage the effort. Just one last thing. I mean, the precautionary approach is really important. If we were to wait until we had a full data set for all of those species, I mean, that would be 3 to 5 years down the line probably, and will come during the course of the channel FMP process. That feels too long to wait. And I sort of see some nods. I guess there are others that would dispute that, but doing nothing and sitting back and doing nothing while we wait for great data feels as if would be a misguided approach.
Yeah, thanks.